Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to try to untangle this whole heredity thing. Like what makes you you? How do those traits get passed down from one generation to the next? We've got some great research to dig into, so let's get started.
Yeah, it's a fascinating topic for sure. We'll be covering a lot of ground from those basic building blocks of inheritance to some mechanisms that are surprisingly complex.
Perfect. So, where do we even begin? Heredity feels so vast.
Well, we can start with something simple. The fact that children tend to look like their parents.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter if we're talking about people, plants, or even bacteria. You see that continuity, those shared traits across generations.
Right. Like I have my mom's curly hair
Uh-huh.
and my dad's love of spicy food.
Okay.
But how does that actually happen?
Right.
Is it like there's a tiny instruction manual?
That's a great way to think about it.
Yeah.
And you're right, there is. It's called DNA. That molecule carries the genetic code, and that code is what determines an organism's traits.
Oh, DNA. That's that famous double helix everyone's always talking about. Crazy to think something so tiny is like the blueprint for a whole living being.
It really is. And what's even more fascinating is this. During reproduction, that blueprint isn't always copied perfectly. There's room for variation.
So it's not like, say, a photocopy machine.
Exactly. Every copy is not identical.
Mm.
Whether an organism reproduces sexually or asexually, you get variations popping up in that copying process. And that's what makes each individual unique.
Okay, that makes sense. So even siblings, they share parents, they won't be exactly alike because of these variations.
Precisely. And when we're talking about sexual reproduction, the variations actually get amplified even more because now you're combining genetic material from two different individuals.
So it's like you're shuffling two decks of cards together. You end up with all kinds of new combinations. So that means that sexual reproduction leads to more variations than asexual reproduction.
Generally, yes. Sexual reproduction, it allows for a greater mixing of genes, which means a wider range of traits in those offspring.
Wow. So all that diversity we see out there in the world, from all those dog breeds to like the endless varieties of flowers, that's thanks to these variations.
They play a huge role, and it's not just about how things look either. These variations are actually vital for survival.
Oh, really?
Yeah, imagine if everyone was identical. A single disease or even like an environmental change could just wipe everybody out.
That's kind of scary to think about. So these variations are like a safety net.
Exactly. Some variations might give an organism, a leg up in a certain environment that would make it more likely to survive and reproduce. And this process, where the organisms with those advantageous traits are more likely to pass on their genes, that's called natural selection.
So variations are like the raw material that evolution works with.
Precisely. Now, let's take a second to define this. What do we actually mean by variation?
Okay, so what is variation in like a biological sense?
Basically, it's those differences that we see between individuals in a population. And it's not just physical stuff. Could be physical traits, behaviors, even differences down at the molecular level.
So it's not just about like hair color or height.
Nope.
You're saying there can be variations we can't even see.
Absolutely. They can be right there in the genetic makeup, even if those differences don't lead to visible changes.
Wow, so variation is way more than I first thought. Like a whole hidden world of differences.
Exactly.
That's driving all that diversity of life.
Now, before we jump ahead, any questions about variation?
No, that was really clear. I think we're ready to move on to the next idea. What comes after variation on our heredity journey?
Let's talk about inherited traits. What gets passed down from parents to their kids?
Okay, so this is why I have my mom's curly hair and not my dad's straight hair.
Exactly. And these inherited traits are determined by genes. Those are segments of DNA that carry the instructions for building and maintaining an organism.
So genes are like the individual blueprints inside that bigger DNA instruction manual.
That's a great way to put it. And each gene, holds the code for a specific trait. Could be eye color, hair texture, even like susceptibility to certain diseases.
And we get these genes from our parents.
Yes, you inherit two versions of each gene, one from your mother and one from your father. And these different versions, they're called alleles.
So it's not just like a straight copy-paste then.
Not quite. Think of it this way. Like, you get two different recipes for chocolate chip cookies, one from each parent.
Okay.
And those recipes, they might be slightly different, which means the cookies end up with subtle variations. Maybe the taste is a little different or the texture.
I see. So even though both recipes make chocolate chip cookies, the final cookie might not be exactly the same because of those variations.
Exactly. Now let's be clear about what we mean by inherited traits.
Okay, so how would you define an inherited trait?
An inherited trait is a characteristic that is passed down from parents to offspring through their genes. This could be stuff like eye color or height, but also things like blood type, or even a predisposition to certain diseases.
So it's any characteristic that's based in our genes and gets passed on to the next generation.
Precisely. Now, before we move on, any questions about inherited traits?
No, that was very clear. I think I'm starting to get how genes play a part in making us who we are. So what's the next step in understanding how these traits get passed down?
We got to talk about Gregor Mendel, considered the father of genetics. His work really makes us understand.
Mendel, wasn't he the one who did all those experiments with pea plants? I vaguely remember learning about that in school.
You're right. His experiments totally revolutionized how we think about inheritance. He meticulously tracked traits, things like plant height, seed shape, across generations. And his findings, well, they laid the foundation for modern genetics.
So what did he find? What was so groundbreaking about his work?
One of the key things was this concept of dominant and recessive traits. He saw that some traits would kind of mask others, like tallness in pea plants. It seemed to hide the shortness trait.
So tallness was kind of a dominant force, pushing that shortness trait into the background.
Exactly. And he called these traits dominant. The ones that were hidden, he called those recessive. He figured out that for each trait, an organism inherits two factors, one from each parent. And these factors are what we now call genes.
Okay, so we get two versions of each gene, one from each parent.
Right.
And some of those versions are dominant while others are recessive.
Precisely. And a dominant trait will show up even if there's only one copy of that dominant allele present. But a recessive trait, that'll only show up if there are two copies of the recessive allele.
Okay, I think I'm getting it. So like if I get a gene for brown eyes from one parent and a gene for blue eyes from the other, I'll have brown eyes because that brown eye gene is dominant.
Exactly. That's a perfect example. Now, before we go any deeper into Mendel's work, are there any questions about dominant and recessive traits? Great example. Let's make sure we're all clear on these definitions, though. Dominant and recessive traits.
Okay, lay them on me. Let's solidify this.
A dominant trait, it's expressed even if someone only has one copy of that dominant allele. It basically covers up, masks the expression of that recessive allele.
Like the dominant trait is the louder voice in the room, drowning the other one out.
That's a great analogy. Now, a recessive trait, that's only expressed if an individual gets two copies of the recessive allele.
So the recessive trait only gets to speak if both parents give the same allele, huh?
Exactly. So back to Mendel. He didn't just look at these dominant and recessive traits. He wanted to see what happens when you look at multiple traits together.
Okay, this is where I start to get lost. Does it all just become a jumbled mess of genes, like everything gets mixed up?
That's a common thought, but Mendel actually showed that traits can be inherited independently.
Hold on. Independently. So, getting my mom's curly hair has nothing to do with whether I get my dad's love of spicy food.
That's the idea. His experiments showed that genes for different traits, they can be sorted and passed down independently. This happens during gamete formation. You know, those reproductive cells like sperm and eggs.
I see. So it's not like hair texture and taste preferences are all bundled together.
Right. Each trait is like its own separate roll of the dice. And this independent inheritance thing, it's super important for understanding the diversity we see within species.
So it's like traits are all mixed and matched, like a giant genetic puzzle.
Exactly. And that's why siblings can share some traits, but not others. It all comes down to the specific combination they inherit from their parents.
That makes so much sense. Before we go on, can we just formally define independent inheritance?
Of course. Independent inheritance, also known as Mendel's law of independent assortment, states that during gamete formation, the alleles for different traits segregate independently of each other. So inheriting one trait doesn't influence the inheritance of another.
Wow, that's a mouthful. But I think I'm with you. It's like traits are like independent travelers, each on their own genetic journey.
I love that. Any other questions about independent inheritance before we move on to the next cool part of heredity?
I think I'm good for now. What's next on the list?
All right, let's shift gears. We've talked genes and DNA, but this stuff isn't just floating around in our cells all willy-nilly.
Right.
There's organization to it, and that's where chromosomes come in.
Oh, chromosomes. Those are those X-shaped things you see in all the textbooks.
Yeah, got it. Chromosomes, they're like little packages of DNA.
Mhm.
They're thread-like structures made of DNA and proteins, and you find them in the nucleus of every single cell, basically organized bundles of genetic information.
So chromosomes are like the filing cabinets where our genes are stored.
Perfect analogy. And just like those cabinets have drawers, chromosomes come in pairs.
Okay.
Humans, we've got 23 pairs, a total of 46 chromosomes.
So we get half our chromosomes from our mom and half from our dad.
That's right. And since genes live on these chromosomes, that means we inherit 2 copies of most genes, one from each parent.
It's all starting to click into place now. So these pairs of chromosomes, they're what determine our own unique combo of traits.
Exactly. And this pairing is also how traits can be inherited independently, like Mendel figured out. You see, genes for different traits are often located on different chromosomes.
Oh, interesting. So like if hair color's on one chromosome and eye color's on a different one, they can be inherited separately from each other.
Exactly. That's how you get someone with, say, their mother's hair color but their father's eye color.
That is fascinating. Before we go on, though, can we get a formal definition of a chromosome?
Sure thing. A chromosome is a thread-like structure you find in the nucleus of most living cells. It carries genetic information in the form of genes, and each chromosome is made up of DNA tightly coiled around proteins called histones. Those proteins, they support the chromosome's structure.
Wow, those X-shaped things are actually incredibly complex bundles of information, huh? Now, I have a question about chromosomes and sex determination. You mentioned earlier that sex is determined by a special pair of chromosomes, right?
Right, you are. Most of our chromosomes come in matching pairs, but the sex chromosomes, those are different.
We're talking X and Y chromosomes.
Bingo. Females, they've got 2 X chromosomes XX. Males have 1 X and 1 YXY.
So it all depends on which chromosome the dad passes down.
You got it. If it's an X, the kid will be female, XX. If it's a Y, the kid will be male, XY.
It's like a genetic coin flip that decides our biological sex.
Great way to put it. And that Y chromosome, it carries genes that set off the development of male characteristics.
This is amazing. It's crazy how something so basic, so fundamental, as our biological sex is decided by these tiny little chromosomes. Before we keep going, can you give a quick formal definition of sex chromosomes?
Sure. Sex chromosomes, they're a pair of chromosomes that determine an individual's sex. In humans, it's the X and Y chromosomes. Females are XX, males are XY. And that Y chromosome carries genes that trigger male development.
Okay, that's very clear. I feel like I'm finally seeing this big picture of heredity, how it all works. We've gone from DNA and genes to chromosomes and even sex determination.
We have covered a lot.
And I'm sure I'll have even more questions as we continue.
Yeah, I bet you will.
But I think our listeners might need a moment to process all this. All right, welcome back to our deep dive on heredity. We've been talking about these complex mechanisms that make us who we are.
Right.
Now I think it's time to really focus in on human traits.
Okay.
See how they get passed down through the generations.
It's a fascinating area. I mean, it's deeply personal in a way,
Yeah.
but it's also something everyone can relate to. We all inherit these unique sets of traits, right?
And I bet everyone's wondered, like, why do I have this eye color? Or why is my hair this way?
Exactly. So let's start with this idea of single gene traits. These are traits that are mainly determined by just one gene.
So it's like a direct link. One gene equals one trait.
Well, in a simplified way, yes. But we got to remember that even these single gene traits, they can still be influenced by other things, like the environment, or even how that gene interacts with other genes.
Okay, so it's not always a simple equation then.
Nope. Biology is rarely that straightforward. But to help us understand, let's look at freckles. That's a classic example of a single gene trait.
Freckles. Those little spots that people have, I've always wondered what causes them.
Well, whether or not you have freckles, that's mainly determined by a gene called MC1R.
MC1R.
Yeah. And that gene, it's involved in making melanin, which gives our skin its color.
So you're saying if you inherit a specific version of that MC1R gene, you're more likely to have freckles.
Exactly. Although, again, it's not a guaranteed thing. Things like sun exposure, that also plays a role.
That makes sense. Like I've noticed that my freckles, they get darker in the summer.
There you go. That's genes and the environment working together to influence a trait.
That is so cool. So before we go on, can you define what a single gene trait is? Just so we're all on the same page.
Of course. A single gene trait is a characteristic that is primarily determined by the variation of a single gene. These traits, they often have clear and predictable inheritance patterns, which makes them pretty easy to study.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about traits that are more complicated, like ones that are influenced by multiple genes?
Right. A lot of human traits are actually what we call polygenic. meaning they're influenced by a bunch of different genes working together.
It's like a group project, genetically speaking.
Exactly. Take height, for instance. Hundreds of genes contribute to a person's final height.
That explains why you might see tallness running in a family.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not a guarantee that everyone will be tall.
Right. Plus, we got to factor in those environmental influences, too. It's always that combo of nature and nurture.
Makes sense. Can we get a definition for polygenic traits as well?
Absolutely. A polygenic trait is a characteristic that's influenced by multiple genes,
Okay.
and they often show a wider range of variations, and they're harder to predict compared to those single gene traits.
Got it. Now, I'm curious, what happens when something goes wrong with our genes?
Hmm.
Like, how do genetic disorders fit into all of this?
That's a really important part of heredity. Some disorders are caused by mutations in single genes.
Mutations, those are like typos in the DNA code, right?
Exactly. And those typos, they can change the instructions for making proteins, so the protein doesn't work like it should.
So if there's a mutation in a gene, the protein might not be functional.
That's right. And that can have a ripple effect, throughout the body, causing a genetic disorder.
Can you give an example, like a specific disorder caused by a single gene mutation?
Sure, cystic fibrosis, it affects the lungs and the digestive system.
Oh, right.
And it's caused by a mutation in a gene called CFTR. That gene makes a protein that controls salt and water movement in and out of cells.
So if there's a mutation in CFTR, it throws off that salt and water balance.
Uh-huh.
And that's what leads to the symptoms of cystic fibrosis.
Exactly. It shows how even one single gene mutation can have a big impact on someone's health.
That's a powerful example. Okay, before we go any further, can we just, define what a genetic disorder is?
Of course. A genetic disorder is a condition that's caused by abnormalities in an individual's genetic material.
Mm.
And these abnormalities, they can be small, like little mutations in single genes, or they can be bigger changes in the structure or the number of chromosomes.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, I know that not all genetic disorders are caused by just one gene, right?
Right.
What about the ones that are more complex?
Yeah, a lot of disorders are complex. They involve multiple genes and environmental factors, too.
So it's like a lot of things have to go wrong for the disorder to happen.
Exactly. And figuring out all those interactions, that's a big challenge for genetic researchers.
It's pretty amazing how much we're learning about our genes and how they affect our health.
It really is. And we're learning to use this knowledge, too, like with genetic testing and genetic counseling.
Right, those tests can help us spot risks for certain disorders.
Right, exactly. And genetic counselors can help people understand those test results, make informed decisions about their health.
It's empowering to have that kind of knowledge, I think.
I agree. Understanding our genetic makeup can give us so much insight into our health and where we come from.
Wow, well, I think we've covered a ton of ground in this deep dive. We started with those basic building blocks, DNA and genes. Then we got into those complex mechanisms like chromosomes and sex determination, and even touched on genetic disorders.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey.
I feel like our listeners now have a good grasp on how traits get passed down from generation to generation.
And hopefully they've got a new appreciation for how it all works. It's this intricate dance between genes, proteins, and the environment that makes each of us who we are.
I think so too. So to wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about. Knowing what you now know about heredity, how do you think that changes how you view your own family traits and your own health?
That's a great question to ponder. Our genes, they tell a story. And by understanding that story, we can learn so much about ourselves and where we fit into this bigger picture of life.
And as we keep unraveling these mysteries of heredity, who knows what other amazing discoveries we'll make?
That's the exciting part. So until next time, keep on exploring the world of genetics. You never know what you might find.